The emergency room of St. Jude's Metropolitan Hospital was a symphony of controlled chaos, a place where life and death danced a frantic tango under the unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights. The air, thick with the metallic tang of blood and the sharp, clean scent of antiseptic, was a constant assault on the senses. It was a world of beeping monitors, the rushed squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, and the low, pained moans of the afflicted. In the heart of this maelstrom moved nurse Elara Vance. She was new, a recent addition to the ER's seasoned crew, and she moved with a quiet efficiency that was both unnerving and deeply impressive. Where others shouted, she spoke in low, calm tones. Where others scrambled, she flowed. An island of placid competence in a sea of frantic energy. Her hands, when administering an IV or dressing a wound, were impossibly steady, her touch gentle yet firm, a study in practiced economy. She was a ghost in pale blue scrubs, her face framed by dark hair pulled back in a severe, functional bun. Her expression was perpetually neutral, her gaze distant, as if she were observing the world from behind a pane of thick glass. But it was her arms that drew the whispers. From the cuffs of her sleeves to the backs of her hands, her skin was a roadmap of old injuries. A puckered, starburst-shaped burn marred her right forearm, its edges smooth with age. Silvery, jagged lines crisscrossed her left, some thin as thread, others thick and raised, a testament to something violent and sharp. The nurse's lounge buzzed with speculation. A car accident, some suggested. A house fire, others guessed. The younger, more dramatic nurses spun tales of a dark, tumultuous past, their voices dropping to conspiratorial whispers whenever Elara passed by. She heard them, of course. She heard everything. Her situational awareness was preternatural. But she never offered an explanation, her silence a wall they could not breach, which they invariably mistook for weakness or shame. Her competency, however, was beyond reproach. During a 5-car pileup on the interstate that had flooded the ER with trauma victims, she had been a force of nature. While others were paralyzed by the sheer volume of carnage, Elara's eyes had swept the incoming gurneys with an analytical coldness. She performed triage with the speed and certainty of a machine, her diagnoses unnervingly accurate. She had flagged a man with seemingly minor head lacerations for an immediate CT scan, her fingers finding a subtle depression in his skull, a fracture that the attending physician had missed. The neurosurgeon later said she had saved the man's life. She had set a dislocated shoulder with a single, fluid motion that was more martial than medical, the pop of the joint echoing in the trauma bay. She never smiled, never sought praise. She simply moved on to the next patient, her focus absolute. It was this detached perfection that most unsettled her colleagues, especially the charge nurse, Brenda. Brenda was a woman who had clawed her way to her minor position of authority and wore it like a royal mantle. She was short, sharp-featured, and ruled her floor through a combination of passive aggression and petty tyranny. She saw Elara's quiet competence not as an asset, but as a silent judgment on her own frantic, often inefficient management style. Brenda thrived on drama, on being the center of the ER's social and professional orbit. Elara's refusal to engage, her serene self-containment, was an affront. The scars were simply a convenient, visible target for Brenda's resentment. She saw them as a blemish, not just on Elara, but on the pristine, professional image she tried to cultivate for her department. The confrontation came on a Tuesday, during the midday lull. The ER was unnaturally quiet, a held breath before the evening rush. Elara was in the break room, methodically cleaning her stethoscope with an alcohol wipe. Brenda entered, a clipboard pressed to her chest like a shield, her face a mask of sour disapproval. Two other nurses, younger women who orbited Brenda like pilotfish, trailed in her wake. The room fell silent. "Elara," Brenda began, her voice dripping with false concern, "we need to talk about your appearance." Elara paused, her hands still, and slowly raised her eyes. They were a deep, placid gray, and they held Brenda's gaze without a flicker of emotion. Specifically, Brenda continued, emboldened by Elara's silence, "Your arms. Patients have made comments. It's unprofessional. It makes people uncomfortable." She gestured vaguely at Elara's forearms. "Honestly, whatever happened, you should consider long sleeves. We have a standard to maintain. People might get the wrong idea about your stability." The final word was loaded, a poison-tipped dart aimed directly at Elara's composure. The other nurses shifted, one looking down at her shoes, the other watching with a kind of predatory glee. Elara looked down at her own arms, at the pale, intricate network of scars. For a fleeting second, a shadow passed through her eyes, a memory so swift and violent that it was gone before the others could register it. She saw not a hospital break room, but a sky filled with smoke and the orange glow of burning wreckage. She smelled not coffee and stale donuts, but cordite, dust, and ozone. She felt not the smooth plastic of her stethoscope, but the rough, hot metal of a rifle stock against her shoulder. Then, it was gone. She folded the alcohol wipe into a neat square, dropped it into the bin, and met Brenda's gaze once more. She said nothing. The silence stretched, becoming a weapon in itself. It unnerved Brenda more than any shouted retort could have. Finally, Elara simply turned and walked out of the room, her back straight, her footsteps silent. The air she left behind was thick with humiliation and a simmering, unspoken rage, all of it Brenda's. Brenda, furious at being so completely dismissed, went straight to the hospital administrator's office. Mr. Sterling was a man made of lukewarm water and political calculation. He was tall, thin, and had a nervous habit of adjusting his tie whenever confronted with a problem that couldn't be solved with a budget sheet. He valued appearances and, more importantly, the avoidance of any potential litigation above all else. Brenda, breathless and indignant, painted a picture of a disturbed, uncommunicative, and potentially unstable employee whose gruesome scars were frightening patients and whose insubordination was undermining morale. "She's a liability, Mr. Sterling," Brenda insisted, her voice shrill. "What if she's a cutter? What if she has a breakdown in the middle of a code? Think of the hospital's exposure." Sterling's face paled at the word liability. He didn't care about the truth, he cared about the perception. An employee with a visible, unexplained history of trauma was a variable he couldn't control. A formal complaint from his charge nurse gave him the perfect pretext. He convened a brief, perfunctory meeting. Elara stood before Sterling's large mahogany desk, Brenda seated to the side, looking vindicated. "Nurse Vance," Sterling began, avoiding her eyes, "in light of charge nurse Brenda's concerns about your overall well-being and its potential impact on patient care, we are placing you on administrative leave, effective immediately." He slid a form across the desk. "This is pending a mandatory psychological evaluation. We need to be sure you are fit for duty." It was a dismissal wrapped in the language of corporate concern. A public shaming. Elara looked from Sterling's weak, evasive face to Brenda's triumphant smirk. She felt nothing, or rather, she felt a familiar, cold resignation. The world was full of Brendas and Sterlings, She had seen their type in polished boardrooms and dusty command tents. They were the same everywhere. Without a word, she turned and walked away. She was clearing her locker when the world changed. It began not with a bang, but with a series of soft, metallic clicks. The magnetic locks on the ER's main doors engaging simultaneously. Then, a woman's scream, cut short. A new kind of silence fell over the hospital, a heavy, predatory quiet that was vastly different from the earlier lull. Elara froze, her hand inside her locker. Her head tilted, her senses expanding, tasting the air. She heard the subtle scuff of heavy boots on tile, the faint rustle of tactical gear. It was a sound she knew in her bones. She slowly closed her locker door, the quiet click deafening in the sudden stillness. Through the small window in the staff room door, she saw them. 4 men, clad in black, moving with the fluid, terrifying grace of professionals. They weren't common criminals. They wore body armor, carried suppressed carbines, and moved in a practiced diamond formation, covering every angle. This was a takeover, a planned, military-style assault. The lead operative, a man with a cold, dead-eyed stare, barked an order. Nobody moves. Phones on the floor, now. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Panic erupted. A nurse screamed and tried to run, and another operative backhanded her with contemptuous ease, sending her sprawling. Brenda, who had been preening near the nurse's station, froze, her face a mask of disbelief and terror. Mr. Sterling, who had followed Elara out to ensure she left the premises, made a faint whimpering sound and seemed to shrink into himself. The operatives were efficient. They herded the staff and the few remaining patients into the center of the main ER bay, their movements quick and brutal. Elara remained by the lockers, partially obscured by a gurney. She didn't panic. Her breathing was slow and even, her heart rate steady. The weary nurse was gone. In her place stood something else, something forged in crucibles Brenda and Sterling could not even imagine. Her mind was a cold, clear stream of tactical analysis. 4 hostiles, armed with short-barreled rifles, likely 5.56 mem. Standard sidearms. Earpieces for comms, no visible explosives. Objective unknown. One of the operatives broke off, heading toward the private observation rooms. Elara's eyes followed him. She knew that room 3 held a patient admitted under a pseudonym, a Mr. Black, for a sudden, severe bout of sepsis. He was guarded by 2 quiet, athletic men who had identified themselves as private security. Elara had noted their posture, the subtle bulges under their jackets, the way their eyes constantly scanned the room. They weren't private security. They were feds or military. That was the target. The takeover wasn't random. A firefight erupted from room 3. The sharp, contained cracks of suppressed gunfire. One of the operatives stumbled back out, clutching a bleeding arm, cursing, "They're armed." He yelled. The leader, his face contorting in a snarl, gestured to his men. "Breach and clear. I want him alive." As 2 of the hostiles prepared to storm the room, the leader turned his attention to the hostages. His eyes swept the terrified group and landed on a hospital security guard, an older man named George, who was trying to subtly reach for the panic button under the counter. "You," the leader snarled, raising his rifle. "Bad idea." George froze, his hand hovering. The leader smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. Discipline must be maintained. He started to level the rifle at George's head. Brenda sobbed. Sterling looked like he was about to faint. Time seemed to slow down. Elara saw the trajectory, the tightening of the man's finger on the trigger, the resignation in George's eyes. It was a calculation she had made 1,000 times before. Threat, asset, action. The mask didn't just drop, it shattered. Elara moved. She wasn't a nurse anymore, she was a weapon. From a surgical tray beside her, her hand snatched a 16-inch Kelly hemostat, a long, slender steel clamp. In one fluid, silent motion, she closed the distance between herself and the nearest hostile, who was focused on the hostages. Her movement was a whisper, a blur. He never saw her coming. She drove the pointed tip of the hemostat into the soft tissue just beneath his jaw, angling up and in, severing the carotid artery and jugular vein. It was a brutally precise, medically informed killing strike. He made a choked, gurgling sound, his eyes wide with shock as his own blood erupted in a hot spray. He dropped his rifle as his brain was starved of oxygen, his body collapsing like a puppet with its strings cut. Before the first body had even settled, she was already moving on the second. This one, alerted by the gurgle, started to turn. He was too slow. Elara caught his rifle, twisting it with a violent wrench of her wrists that she knew would break his grip and possibly his fingers. Using the weapon as a lever, she spun him around, slamming his head into a steel supply cabinet with a sickening crunch of bone. As he staggered, she disarmed him, the rifle now in her hands. It felt like an extension of her own body. The weight, the balance, the cold, familiar geometry of it. She didn't raise it to her shoulder. In one smooth, continuous action, she brought the stock around in a short, vicious arc, cracking it against the temple of the third operative who was just realizing what was happening. He dropped like a stone, unconscious, 3 down in less than 5 seconds. The ER was utterly silent, save for the dying gurgle of the first man and the frantic beeping of a heart monitor. Brenda stared, her mouth hanging open, a thin line of drool tracing its way down her chin. Her mind simply could not process what it had just seen. The quiet, mousy nurse she had bullied had just dismantled a team of trained killers with the savage grace of a panther. Mr. Sterling had slid down the wall into a trembling, fetal position. The remaining hospital staff were frozen, their faces a mixture of terror and pure, unadulterated awe. From inside room 3, one of the private security men, now revealed to be a Navy SEAL, leaned out. He was bleeding from a gunshot wound to his leg, his face pale, but his eyes were wide with dawning recognition as he watched Elara. He had seen that kind of movement before, but only in legends, in stories told in hushed tones, in mission debriefs. The leader, the last man standing, was a true professional. He didn't panic, he reacted. He spun, bringing his carbine to bear on Elara. But she was no longer there. She had already moved, using a gurney as rolling cover, her silhouette impossibly low. The leader fired a short, controlled burst, the suppressed rounds thudding into the mattress. Thump, thump, thump. Elara was already past it. She came up on his flank, the captured rifle held in a one-handed combat grip. She didn't fire. She didn't need to. She used the weapon as a blunt instrument, driving the barrel into his sternum, forcing the air from his lungs in a sharp gasp. As he doubled over, she brought her knee up in a devastating strike to his face, the sound of breaking cartilage sickeningly loud in the quiet room. He staggered back, dazed, blood pouring from his nose. He tried to raise his weapon again, but his movements were sluggish. Elara stepped inside his guard, her hand a blur. She snatched the scalpel from the pocket of her scrubs, the one she used to open sterile packaging. With surgical precision, she drew the blade across the exposed tendons on the back of his hand. He screamed, a raw, animal sound of pain, and his rifle clattered to the floor. His hand was useless. She kicked the weapon away and stood over him, her expression as cold and flat as a winter sky. The fight was over. The entire, brutal engagement had lasted less than 30 seconds. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. The wounded SEAL from Room 3, Lieutenant Commander Jackson, limped out, using the doorframe for support. He held a pistol, but it was pointed at the floor. He stared at Elara, his eyes moving from her calm, deadly posture to the carnage she had wrought, and then to the scars on her arms. A look of profound, almost religious, awe dawned on his face. "No way," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It can't be. Valkyrie?" Elara's gaze shifted to him. The coldness in her eyes receded slightly, replaced by a clinical focus. "You're hit," she stated, her voice flat. "Femoral artery?" He shook his head. "Through and through, left thigh. Missed the bone. I'll live." She gave a single, sharp nod. "Apply pressure. Stay off it." Her attention then went to the high-value patient, who was now visible, pale and shaken on his bed. She did a quick visual assessment, noting his vitals on the monitor. Stable, the immediate threat was neutralized. The assets were secure. Her mission, self-appointed, was complete. She stood in the center of the room, a scalpel in one hand, a captured rifle at her feet, surrounded by broken men. And for the first time, her former colleagues saw her. They saw the truth of her. A truth written not in whispers and rumors, but in blood and brutal efficiency. The wail of sirens grew louder, converging on the hospital from all directions. But it wasn't the flashing red and blue of local police that filled the ambulance bay. A fleet of unmarked black Chevrolet Suburbans and a single, menacing wrap vehicle screeched to a halt. Doors flew open, and men poured out, not police officers, but soldiers in full combat gear. They wore no unit patches, only the stark, ominous insignia of the Joint Special Operations Command. They moved with the same terrifying purpose as the men Elara had just dispatched, but with a level of discipline that was an order of magnitude higher. They formed a perimeter, their weapons held at a low ready, their eyes scanning everything, missing nothing. The ER doors burst open, and a man strode in who seemed to suck all the air from the room. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his hair a close-cropped silver. He wore the immaculate dress uniform of a 4-star Army general, his chest a dazzling constellation of ribbons and medals. His face was granite, carved by decades of command and conflict. This was General Thorne, a man who spoke to presidents and moved armies. His eyes, the color of chips of ice, swept the scene, the downed hostiles, the terrified staff, the wounded SEAL, before finally landing on Elara. He stopped dead. The entire phalanx of elite soldiers behind him seemed to hold their breath. All the noise, all the authority, all the sheer force of the United States military paused for the quiet woman in blood, spattered scrubs. Thorne's granite expression softened, just for a moment, into something that looked like profound relief. He ignored everyone else in the room as if they were furniture. He took 2 long strides forward, his boots echoing on the tile. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble that commanded absolute attention, a sound forged in command tents and amplified over the roar of battle. "Valkyrie," he said, the name an exhalation of disbelief and reverence. "By God, we thought you were dead." The name hung in the air. Lieutenant Commander Jackson, leaning against the wall, let out a shaky breath. The SEALs who had entered with Thorne stared at Elara, their professional hardness cracking, their expressions shifting to awe. They knew the name. Every operator in the community knew the name Valkyrie. It was a legend, a ghost story told to inspire recruits and sober veterans. Brenda, her terror momentarily eclipsed by her pathological need to assert her non-existent authority, finally found her voice. It was a pathetic, trembling squeak. "General, General, thank God you're here." This nurse, she went crazy. She attacked these men. She killed him. She pointed a shaking finger at Elara, then at the body of the first operative, lying in a cooling pool of his own blood. General Thorne's head swiveled slowly, and he fixed Brenda with a look of such pure, unadulterated contempt that she physically flinched, her words dying in her throat. His eyes were not just cold now, they were glacial. "You will be silent," he commanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that was somehow louder than a shout. "You will not speak her name. You are not worthy to speak her name." He turned his back on her completely, a dismissal more profound than any verbal rebuke. He addressed the entire room, his voice rising to a booming pronouncement meant for every soul present. His gaze fell upon the stunned, shamed faces of the other nurses, on the cowering form of Mr. Sterling, and finally settled on Brenda. "You," he began, his voice laced with fury, "have been whispering about her, judging her. You looked at these," and he pointed a powerful, unadorned finger at Elara's left forearm, at the silvery latticework of scars. "You saw weakness. You saw ugliness. You saw a liability." He took a step closer to Elara, his voice softening with a deep, abiding respect. "Let me tell you what I see. I see the price of courage," he boomed, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. He gently touched the edge of the puckered burn mark on her other arm. "This scar? This is from Kandahar, Operation Vigilant Saber." She was shielding a 5-year-old girl from the blast of an Eid that insurgents threw into a crowded market. She took the full force of the shrapnel and the heat on her own body to save a child whose name she never even knew. He traced one of the long, jagged lines on her other arm. "This one? This is from the Zangali Valley. A Chinook helicopter carrying a team of my rangers was shot down. The wreckage was on fire, ammunition cooking off, and the entire valley was crawling with enemy fighters. She was the pararescue jumper on the KRF bird. She rappelled into that hellscape alone. Alone, she pulled 3 critically wounded men from the burning fuselage while taking fire from 3 sides. This scar is from a piece of the helicopter's rotor that pinned her against a bulkhead. She worked for 2 hours with a compound fracture in her own leg to free a trapped ranger, all while holding a severed artery in his neck closed with her bare hands." He turned his gaze back to the assembled SEALs. "And this team," he said, gesturing to the wounded Lieutenant Commander Jackson and his men, "this team owes her their lives." Operation Neptune's Spear. They were compromised, pinned down in a 3-story building, wounded, out of ammo, with a battalion-sized enemy force closing in. No exfil possible. They were preparing to make their last stand. We all thought they were gone. His voice cracked with emotion for the first time. But then, over the comms, we heard a new voice. A calm, quiet voice that said, "Valkyrie is on station. Sit tight, boys. I'm coming to get you." She had disobeyed a direct order to stand down, commandeered a Little Bird helicopter, and flew it through a storm of RPGs and heavy machine gun fire. She landed that bird on a rooftop that was crumbling under fire, held off a wave of attackers with her sidearm while her crew chief loaded the wounded, and then flew them out through the very gates of hell. The scars she earned that night are the ones you can't see. He let the silence hang, a heavy shroud of shame and revelation. He looked directly at Brenda and Sterling. "She is Master Sergeant Elara Vance, United States Air Force, the single most decorated combat medic of the global war on terror. Recipient of the Air Force Cross, the Silver Star, and a Medal of Honor that she was awarded posthumously, because we all believed she had perished in the crash that finally brought her down 6 months after she saved this team." His eyes narrowed into slits. "She didn't die. She just disappeared. She wanted peace. She came here, to this place, to heal people, to save lives quietly, without fanfare. And you harassed her. You humiliated her. You tried to fire her because her medals, earned in blood and sacrifice, made you uncomfortable." Thorne's aide, a grim-faced colonel, stepped forward and handed him a tablet. The general glanced at it. "I have the security footage of this entire incident. I have your formal, written complaint against Master Sergeant Vance, Mr. Sterling. I have sworn testimony from 3 of your own nurses about the verbal abuse she was subjected to by you, charge nurse." His gaze was utterly merciless. Harassing a federal employee and a Medal of Honor recipient is a serious crime. But the gross negligence and breathtaking incompetence that endangered a critical national security asset, that man in room 3, and nearly resulted in the death of a decorated naval officer, is what will utterly destroy you. Consider your careers, your reputations, and your comfortable lives over. Military police will be escorting you for a long talk with some very unfriendly people from the Department of Justice." He nodded curtly to 2 of his soldiers, who stepped forward, their faces impassive. Brenda made a small, choked sound and crumpled, her face ashen. Sterling simply stared, his world collapsing in on him. The spell was broken. A young nurse, one who had always offered Elara a quiet smile in the hallways, began to clap. Her hands made a small, lonely sound in the vast silence. Then another nurse joined her. Then George, the security guard. Soon, the entire room, staff, patients, even the shell-shocked janitor who had been hiding in a supply closet, was filled with a deafening wave of applause. It was a sound of apology, of gratitude, of pure, unadulterated respect. It washed over Elara, who stood unmoved, her face betraying nothing. She looked not at the clapping crowd, but at the wounded SEAL. She walked over to him, her movements once again those of a nurse. She quickly assessed his makeshift bandage. This will need debridement and antibiotics. High risk of infection. Her voice was soft, professional. Lieutenant Commander Jackson just looked at her, his eyes shining. "Thank you, Valkyrie," he breathed. "Thank you." General Thorne walked to her side. His voice, for the first time, was gentle, stripped of its booming authority. It was the voice of a man speaking to a cherished, long-lost soldier. "It's time to come home, Sergeant Vance. Your country still needs you. We need you." Elara looked around the ER, at the blood on the floor, the terrified faces, the flashing lights. This place, which she had hoped would be a sanctuary, was just another kind of battlefield. She had tried to outrun her past, to bury the warrior under layers of quiet service. But the wolf was always there, just beneath the skin. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of acceptance, of surrender. She allowed the general to place a hand on her shoulder and guide her toward the doors. She didn't look back at the people she had worked with, the people who had judged her and were now applauding her. They were part of a life that was already fading, a cover that had been irrevocably blown. As she stepped out into the cool night air, flanked by a phalanx of the world's most elite soldiers, she left behind a profound and lasting silence. In the emergency room of St. Jude's Metropolitan Hospital, no one would ever again look at a person's scars and see only damage. They would see a story. They would see the price of a life lived, of battles fought, of heroism hidden in plain sight. They had thought she was just a quiet, broken nurse. They were dead wrong. She was a guardian angel forged in the fires of war, and they had been lucky enough to stand, however briefly, in her shadow.